what do we know from research about discrimination? It's of course something that has been researched in many different settings, and there are also in Lund University people doing that research. One important distinction is here between what we call structural and individual discrimination. The individual is what happens in the working place. For example, one person is discriminating another one. And some of the examples that I gave here are individual discrimination. And they are often the ones that are treated with laws and so on, regulation. That's the ones we often focus on when we do actions. But sometimes they're structural also. And you could say that the structural ones are enabling the individual ones. And structural discrimination has to do with laws, norms, regulations that in practice are discriminating. Sometimes it's obvious they are. We have a long history of discriminating legislation and norms and so on. And sometimes they might feel like they're okay, but they turn out to be discriminated. For example, if we have norms or rules about publishing the literature for a course, and it's not done well ahead of the start of the course, that could be a structural discrimination because we're not giving the students enough time, for example, to find a read aloud book if they need to use that. The most research is done on the structural part to change the structures that makes it possible for individual discrimination. So here I would like to become much more practical than that and give you one tool for understanding discrimination and counteracting it. And that's the theory of suppression techniques. That's something that's very, very popular, or not popular, but very much used in Nordic countries. It's originated in Norway by a woman called Berit Aas, and she was both a social psychologist, but she was also a member of the parliament. And she was kind of wondering, why was it in the parliament discussions that some people seemed to get their ideas through, listened to, and so on, and some did not. So she started to make observations during meetings. And from that sprang, using older ideas, of course, sprang the idea of suppression techniques. So the idea behind it, as in so many theories about discrimination, is that we're trying to exercise power. We all the time when we negotiate, we interact, we are having power relationship, whether we know there could be strong power relationships like between a teacher and a student, but it could also be between students or between teachers, so to speak. And subconsciously, we are trying to strengthen these power differences if we have power. And this suppression technique can then be illustrating how privileged groups, the groups that automatically have power, so to speak, or easier to have power, can maintain it and even expand it. And then, of course, if you expand your power, you do it at the expense of others. Historically, and that's what Berit also used as one of her dimensions, so to speak, was men against women. What usually call about patriarchal structures, and doubtless that is something that has existed through history, and that still exists. But there are, of course, other also power, should we call it power dimensions, and you will, and the same kind of suppression techniques have been observed. You can always wonder, are they unreflected? Are they unconscious? One would hope so, but sometimes actually they are very conscious and people are using them actually to gain power. Not all the time. And we are kind of led in to use them because they can be extremely efficient. So there are 3 steps if you want to become a suppression technique understander, and we should have a brief little PDF. It might not have been sent out to you yet, but it will be, where you will have this all summarized, and that's called before, and then there will be a little after PDF which gives you all the slides. But if you want to just go back and think about these suppression techniques, the idea was that first what she wanted to do was to understand and classify what happened. And classifying is the first step in understanding, right? And then she wanted also not to make the person a victim, but to empower the victim. She will call that, and later on I'm call that countermeasures, what you can do yourself to kind of oppose a suppression. And then the most important here is, what can you do if you're a bystander? And bystander, if you're not familiar to that expression, means someone is watching but is not participating in what's happening. And sometimes that's referred to confirmation strategies. And there's a whole row of them, and I just will go through some of the most interesting one. And the first one she identified, that is that you make people invisible. So typically, you are simply, the harshest one or the most extreme one maybe is that you just exclude people. You don't let them participate, or you schedule meetings, or you invite people to meetings on times or in ways that not everybody can participate. This is very often talked about if meetings, if you are in any way involved in some meeting here at the Lund University by becoming a student representative and so on, and the meetings are scheduled, let's say after 4:30, you should object to that because not everybody can participate then. Then of course you can, if you are in a boring meeting like Berit Oss did, you can actually look at who gets interrupted and whose ideas are kind of picked up and cherished. She observed one thing that was kind of obvious, that was that some people suggested things and no one really cared. They just continued the meeting, and just 10-15 minutes later another person from another group suggested the same thing, and everybody was standing up and applauding, so to speak. So depending on who's the messenger, things becomes visible, so to speak. But you also, this could be very much something used with body language. And I think if you ever give a talk or a presentation, you will recognize this. People are maybe starting to whisper in the back of the room. People might make just disturbing noises. People might start to play with the phone and so on. Maybe turn their back to very strong ways of making someone invisible. The countermeasure is, of course, easy to say, harder to do maybe, but demand attention, and that's something that's okay to do. Most of all, actually, to try to make meetings formal, transparent, and following procedures, so to speak. And if you observe this to happen, you should act as a bystander and go in. And if someone lost the spotlight, go in and put it back. So if the idea is stolen, point that out. This is a very good idea. It was just as good when it was suggested by this person earlier on. Ridiculing, I already mentioned that. That is when you of course, humor is one of the core values in Lund University. You can always discuss that, but making fun at someone's expense, that is of course not okay. And also, this is, if you are protesting, you might hear people saying, oh, you have no sense of humor. That's also ridiculing someone. And please, that should be also counteracted. Or you can then ridiculing by making them feel or pointing out that they're incompetent, or using stereotypes. And you probably have encountered stereotypes with kind of fun, maybe. But if you are a minority and you are the one that is stereotyped, then you might not think it's so fun. Swedes have no sense of humor or whatever it can be. The countermeasure is questioning. When you're stereotyped or you're ridiculed, often you wake up the next morning and you think, oh, I should have said that. I should have been ridiculing back. The problem with that is that the violence in the communication just escalates. But if you just ask the person doing this bad joke, what did you mean? You put the question back to them, and they are actually then in charge of explaining themselves. And of course, please, this is very hard to do, but maybe actively refuse to laugh at bad jokes or sexistic jokes or homophobic jokes and so on. And confirmation, find the allies and act immediately. This is something that's often discussed. When should we act? When should we oppose a bad joke or a sexistic remark? And all the people I've talked to who has been kind of the target of these things have said, people came after the meeting, came after the party, came after the class and said, we saw what happened, we thought it was awful. That is, of course, important, but it would have been so much more worth if you had acted when it happened. Withholding information, that is unfortunately a very, very powerful trick. People are not informed, or they are not informed in the same way. I talked about earlier if you have meetings where people can't attend, that's also a set of withholding information. And if you come to a meeting where you notice that some people have preparing before, they've had an informal meeting, it could be the coffee break, whatever, and you have not been prepared in the same way, you should ask for postponement. So that's why we're trying to formalize meetings so much, to avoid these things, so that everybody has the same chance. Countermeasures, of course, demand postponement, as I said, and inform the responsible leaders. And confirmation is, if people are not informed, then you inform. If you spread the information, if it's nothing that is sensitive, so to speak. Demand that meetings are transparent and open. Demand that all the discussions are reported and notes. Double bind is damned if you do, damned if you don't. And that doesn't matter what you do, if you belong to a certain group, if you are in a certain situation, it seems to do, doesn't matter. So one very common example is here when it comes to parental leave, for example, that people are damned if they do take parental leave, which we of course hope that people do, but if it then affects their career, then that's a problem. And unfortunately, not always it's taken into account carefully enough that you have been on parental leave. And if you don't take it, you're considered as non-social and not taking your social responsibility. There's also that different people doing the same thing get characterized in different ways. So if someone is careful, another person could be called fuzzy. And this is often happening to people that are in a minority in a place. If someone is determined, a man can be determined, and then women do the same thing, they could be bitchy. If you're listening, one could be considered listening, another could be considered weak. If you're laughing, you could be considered not serious. If you're not laughing, you're boring. So whatever you do, you're damned. So this is patterns that you should, of course, break. And then you should, of course, not go for these kind of labels and trust your own judgment. And wonder if not confirmation would be double reward. Reward people whatever they do instead. And give support and be clear if you are a bystander. And the fifth one here that I want to just mention is blaming and shaming. The suppression here is, do you give people bad conscience for something they are not responsible for? Typical thing is, if you get a task, but the resources and the time you get is not enough, and then you get blamed for not succeeding. The countermeasure is to start to intellectualize, just pointing out, okay, I was supposed to write this essay with 60 pages, and I only got 2 days. This is not possible. And the confirmation is to affirm the norms, that the norms work and back people up, and so on. So that's just some examples of suppression techniques, or the ones that were used by Veritas. Later on, there has been other added, dividing and conquer. You probably recognize that. Objectifying is when someone is giving irrelevant comments on your looks or your attributes that is not relevant. A sexual harassment, well, with the Me Too movement, these are of course well known, but is a real problem in the universe, not less. So now we're going to do a poll here to wake you up a little bit. And my question is, if you recognize from experience, by either being, of course, the target, but also have seen or witnessed as a bystander then some of these suppression technique, and you should be able to vote for as many as you like. So please vote. Sometimes these things are not noticed, and of course, if you are living a life like very much I do myself, if you belong to groups and so on where you very rarely are experiencing discrimination, then it's also hard to see them. That is obvious, right? If you might not see them. And then that is in research called non-events. Sometimes it's referred to non-events, it's non-noticed events. Sometimes they're called cultural role spillover. There is a situation when people in a professional context, I mean, we're talking here when you're a student or you're a teacher or you're a researcher, and you are not treated as that. You're treated primarily as a member of a group. And I think if you are in a minority, this is something that is instantly recognizable, or many people are talking about, they recognize this thing. If you become a minority, when you enter a room, even though you are among civil engineers or among literature scientists or whatever you are, you become that person first. And then secondly, people are kind of thinking about, I wonder what kind of civil engineer he or she is. You could also then be met by a different thing, and people doing research have been talking about this. This comes from a Swedish researcher called Lisa Husso, actually. One is condescending chivalry. That is, which could be something that a teacher could do to give praise to a person for something that this person did, but that the dominant group, the rest of the students, are just assumed that they can do. And of course, that becomes if you get overpraised because you're fixing something, then that could be a kind of discrimination. Benevolent exploitation might even be worse than if you're letting someone do the work and it's not getting any credit for it. And also considerate dominance is another one where, for example, a teacher then draw conclusions about what a student can't do just because they belong to a certain group. And I think you can find examples of these two, kind of the condescending chivalry and considerate dominance. And maybe you have seen it, or maybe you have experienced yourself.